Hey everyone, and welcome to Cheyenne Hills Podcast. Pastor Galen and Nathan Winters are both out of town this week. So Dr. Dick Berry and he's our counselor here at Cheyenne Hills. I'm Kasey Orr, I'm the video producer. We're going to fill in, and right now we're doing a series called Living Proof, and that is all was built around this interview that Pastor Galen and I got to go do in a prison in Torrington of a guy named Brian Noel, whose story is fantastic. His the light in this man and the love of Jesus in him is so bright, even though he's wearing these orange pajamas. It's this almost poetic idea of a man who was imprisoned and yet fully free in Christ. And so, but what comes with that story are suicide ideation, of substance abuse, gun violence. There are all sorts of things. So we had gotten together to talk to Dick Berry, who, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here, Kasey. Glad to be here.
And so he had some thoughts about it, and so we did a video to run at the beginning of the service about kind of some just really brief ideas of what to do if these subjects really kind of hit home for you. And we decided that since we had the time, we'll make a 2-part podcast about just that, about how trauma show up in our lives to affect large and small traumas. I've had a counselor refer to them as big T and little t traumas, because little t's can pile up and actually really affect your life and how you deal with the world around you. And we are going to base this around an article. And where did you find this article?
Kasey, I'm not exactly sure how I came across it. I was just looking for something to help people once they're triggered, because I ended up sometimes in counseling sessions where, if I have like a parent and a child, the parent was really wanting to be a good parent, and the kid was saying, "You're a terrible parent." And the kid really wanted to be competent and make his own decisions, and the mom said, "You're making terrible decisions."
Yeah.
And so what happened is they both got triggered, and in the session I thought, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? Because they were both just really very hurt and upset and angry. And so I was looking for something that said, okay, what am I supposed to do when I've got these people that are triggered? And that's, I think, is one of those God things where I just ran across this article by Leon Seltzer on button pushing. And so I read it and I thought, oh my gosh, this is exactly what I was looking for. And I now know what to do, particularly when people are triggered. I now have a solution for them. And I sort of chuckle because the solution is, Leon in his article says, the very best thing you can do when you are triggered is nothing. Do nothing. And I thought, wait a minute, do nothing. How does that work? So what he ended up saying was, when you are triggered by some trauma from the past, and I want to talk about that more later, but when you're triggered, you are really cranked up, and you've been reminded of a situation in the past where you weren't safe. And so your brain goes, uh-oh, alert, 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 and it cranks up all your systems to be ready to fight or flight.
Yeah.
And so once you're that cranked up and once you feel so vulnerable, it's real easy to want to do something to make that go away.
Yeah.
So you end up punching somebody, hurting somebody, running away, drinking. And so Leon says that whatever you do when you're in that state, it's more likely going to cause things to get worse. So do nothing.
Because the automatic response, and we have all heard that phrase of having your buttons pushed and pulling, and the idea of being triggered. If you think about like a gun trigger and what happens when you push a button, what happens when you pull a trigger, something happens that's automatic.
Yeah.
It is not, it is not different every time. It is the same every time. If you have a button based on a memory that where someone in authority made you feel small, then the next time someone in authority might criticize you, that would hit that button to negatively react and maybe holler and maybe say something you otherwise wouldn't say, or feel anger. The thing I saw that I really liked with him was the fundamental understanding that thoughts lead to feelings and feelings lead to actions. And so that's the process where that's how the button works. The thought is associated with an event. And so the event triggers the thought, which triggers an emotion, which causes a reaction. And those are kind of a preset circuit, right?
Yeah, they are. And so people tend to go through that preset circuit several times, repeating it and never figuring out a way or a way to move ahead so that they aren't triggered and so they can relax and move ahead in life and, just not have to deal with such anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things, Kasey, that I end up trying to talk with people, there's really three components that I try to pay attention to. The event itself, and just have people identify the event. I was, sexually abused as a child, or, my dad ran over me with the car when I was 8,
gosh.
Or whatever it may have been, whatever the event is. So, and then the memory of the event is really important as well, because that can be triggered by other memories that are similar to that. But the one that people often miss is the meaning of the event. So we have the event, the memory of the event, and the meaning of the event.
And meaning we associate with the event.
Yeah, because we don't, as humans, we don't just say, oh, that was an event.
Yeah.
We attach meaning to it, and out of that meaning is how we respond.
So my dad yelled at me, but it's not because he was trying to protect me. My meaning attached to dad yelling at me was that he didn't think much of me, and that hurts my self-esteem.
Yeah.
And whether or not that was the intent, if that's what you associate with it, the next time you are involved in that kind of triggering event, your thought is, this person is trying to demean me or make me small or make me feel lesser or something.
Right.
Like that.
And you end up feeling, you go right back to that event, which then causes you to go back to that meaning. And without even thinking about it, the meaning that got attached was you were 8 years old or something.
Yeah.
And so how much do you know when you're 8?
Yeah, not much.
Yeah. Well, and so one of the interesting things that occurs is when you are triggered, I've heard so many people say, oh man, it was just like I was 8 all over again. I felt like there was nothing I could do. Life was going to be terrible and I was going to be hurt. And I go, oh my goodness. Well, no wonder when you get triggered, it gets so scary.
One of the things that I've gotten to do that makes me think of is I have some military history, and I got to do, remind me what it's called again, EMDR.
EMDR, yeah.
It's basically this trauma therapist with a stick with a white tip on it did this thing. It's they've learned some things. I won't get into it about ways you can use eye movement to attach to memories. It's very strange, but when you have a traumatic event, the memories kind of get scattered, so it's hard to deal with that memory because you have to find the pieces. Anyway, we walked through this process, and she got me to the point where I felt the heat of a night in Iraq. I felt the physical weight of the body armor and backpack on me. I felt the fear. I felt everything that I felt on that night, on that traumatic event. It was as if my body was there, even though my mind knew I was sitting safely in a chair. And it was a surreal kind of experience because basically it felt like exactly what you're talking about, but in a controlled environment, in which case we kind of lifted the lid on the mechanism and looked at the trigger and the feel. And when I was, sitting there in the feeling, but I wasn't being triggered towards the reaction. Yeah. And so that was one way we were able to, in a really, really complicated way.
And EMDR is a researched thing that does help people deal with trauma. And so it seems a little strange to people sometimes when they first start, but it has been helpful.
She pulled out the stick and I was, okay, what's,
where are we going with the stick?
But and not necessarily to push that, but the idea that I have experienced that moment that we could really take apart that mechanism, and the fact that these things we're going to talk about, especially in this the second part of this episode, of the ways of really working with yourself on this, is they are effective because psychologists in the psychology community has discovered so much about the way our brains work with these things.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
And once you've identified the meaning that you've attached to it, in your case, it ended up, the meaning that you attached to your dad not being kind towards you was that somehow you're not worthy, you're less than, or that you're naughty somehow.
Yeah.
And so those feelings and those thoughts get transferred into our adult life.
Yeah.
And so when we are triggered, the event reminds us exactly where we were.
Yeah.
And it creates that meaning. And so whenever you start to act out of that meaning, when you come from that in any situation, that your voice doesn't matter, that you don't understand things, that you are just not together, then that's the mindset that you respond from.
Mm-hmm.
And then it gets reinforced because you didn't do a very good job.
Yep.
Because you were in that mindset.
And the more times you go through that process, you provided the message for a service a while ago where you talked about if you think about a drop of water going over a rock, and if it follows the same path more than a couple times, it'll start to make a groove. The more times it occurs, the deeper groove that is, and the harder it will be to, like you said, the more times that you repeat the thought, feeling, action process of this that we're talking about, the harder it will be to untrain it.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things that they've discovered about the brain, it changes through use. So when you stop the old pattern of, oh, I'm less than, and you put something new in, and that's where I think you have to really train yourself. You put a new message on the tape, and instead of playing the old message, you play the new message.
Yeah. So if there is someone listening right now who feels like they may be in an old dog new trick situation, like there is the brain is incredibly elastic instrument that God has created, and so this is something that if you're young, if you're middle aged, if you're older, it doesn't matter how long you've been digging that trench or running this circuit. They're always reprogrammable. It just takes the longer you've been using it, the longer it takes to, or the more discipline it might take to reroute that.
Yeah, and that's certainly true, Kasey. The other thing, though, that's sort of ironic, because both of these are true at the same time, when I've talked with people and they've said, oh, wait a minute, that was the meaning I attached to that, I can clearly see that's not right.
Yeah.
Because now with my adult coping skills, I can see that was all I could have done. It doesn't mean that I was weak or cowardly or stupid. And so once they can see that, once that mindset changes, once that perspective changes, once the paradigm shifts, people can go, oh, yay, I don't have to be that way anymore.
Once you can get that overhead image, once you see the schematic of where things were going and see that doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And so in that case, conversely, life experience can put you in a situation where it's easier to recognize and maybe acknowledge the incorrectness of a thought process that you've had for years. I know I wasn't until my late 30s that I did trauma therapy that really worked. Well, that's when I was old enough to realize, like, I should probably go take care of this, because 25-year-old me thought, I'm fine. This is fine. I'm a soldier. I'm tough. I can handle this.
Yeah.
So, and that was one of the things that I've looked at, is you look back and you say, well, what could 25-year-old Kasey Orr have done in that situation that wasn't exactly what he did?
Yeah.
And giving that kid some slack has been one of the biggest.
Yeah. And really talking with people about, okay, you were 8 and you were getting beat up every night and locked in your closet. What's an 8-year-old able to do about that? Yeah. And watching people go, okay, nothing. There wasn't anything I could have done. Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, then what that means about you then is that you are not stupid, that you're not defective, that you are not a bad kid. It means that you had a parent that was abusive. Yeah.
And that you were too small at the time to do anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was physical, there was real world limitations to your ability to do things. Yeah. So it feels like a lot of these things come from something that is untrue usually. Yeah. Is that right? That it's mostly something that's untrue that we've associated with it.
And we believed it because there was no reason. I mean, I did the best I could at the time.
Yeah.
And so I ended up believing something about me, something about my identity. And that's one of the things that's really critical, is it's oftentimes connected with a person's identity. So if they can shift the way they look at themselves, life takes on whole new meanings. Yeah. And it's really exciting, because sometimes I can just sit and watch the transformation occur right before my very eyes. You mean I am not bad? I am not a terrible kid? No. And there was a Christian song not too long ago about Dear Younger Me. And then there's also a country music song by Brad Paisley.
I'm writing a letter to me. That's what I
Yeah,
was thinking
yeah.
of.
I had not heard it, so I had to go find the lyrics.
Yeah.
But both of those songs say, as an older person, I want to go back and talk to that younger me.
Yeah.
And so having people write that letter to themselves, Dear Younger Me, you didn't know this, but
Yeah.
this is what I would like to have told you had I known.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't your fault. It wasn't your doing. You did the best you could. And so now you don't have to beat yourself up anymore for it.
Which is a much healthier version of another thing that I know a lot of people tend to do, and myself included in previous time, was rumination, which is where you go back to those memories and you try to relive it from the point of view of that 8-year-old kid or of that 15-year-old kid or whenever that was that happened. And the article we read said a lot of it comes from earlier life, because that's when we have these times where the less experienced human that we are associates these maybe incorrect perceptions.
But the meaning of it is really, really important.
Yeah.
And so sometimes when I ask people, what does this mean? They don't quite know what to say. And so part of what I've really avoided doing was having them describe in any detail the event, because what that tends to do is re-traumatize them.
Yeah.
So what I say is, just give me the general kind of, oh, you were hurt as a kid. Okay. Or you were sexually abused, or your dad came home being drunk and burned the house down.
Yeah.
Or, whatever it was. Give me just kind of a global thing, and then let's talk about the meaning that got attached to it.
Yeah.
Because that tends to be less traumatizing for people. To go back in and rehearse and relive every part of the event typically doesn't help people.
Yeah.
Unless you can do it over time with a different kind of an approach.
Because of the way they would experience that is from that same point of view, which doesn't give them that that new perspective, which is needed to recognize the like I said, the wrong way that those circuits got lined up. If you were inside the house, you can't see how badly the roof is thatched. You have to be outside of it.
To be able to see it. Yeah. Awesome.
Well, we were looking at some of the ways in which these kind of principles. We looked real hard at the Bible to find some examples of biblical characters who went through things like this. There's definitely plenty of trauma in the Old Testament, and obviously the disciples, watching their teacher be killed had to be traumatic. But we were trying to find an example of someone who responded in these ways, and it was a little hard, right? Because it seems like God definitely chose people who could overcome these kind of things, but we do see lots of patterns. Like I this just sprang to mind, and we don't have to keep this, but the way Abraham kept telling people his wife was his sister, because he kept thinking even though he'd learned better, he was like, well, I'm worried because she's so pretty that they'll try to kill me to get her, and so I'll just say that she's my sister. And he did it more than once, and that's the only example I can think of off the top of my head of people repeating patterns of behavior that you think they would have figured out the first time.
Yeah. As we're sitting here and talking about this, Kasey, one of the examples that came to mind is the disciples on Friday, Saturday, and before Sunday occurred.
Yeah. Oh.
They were going, okay, we gave our life to this guy, and now he's dead, and what are we going to do? We just must go back to
fishing. Yeah.
I guess. Yeah. That's all we can do. And so that was their kind of perception, and the meaning that they attached to it was, we're done. We wasted that time.
That's it.
Yeah. And then, yikes. When you think about what occurred, their paradigm shift was, he's alive.
Yeah.
He's alive. And how that so changed their perspective.
Yeah. Well, and that's an interesting analogy, even in the fact that a traumatic event occurred and they returned to what they knew, which was, in their case, being fishermen or otherwise. Yeah. And when we experience traumatic things, sometimes we regress to what we know, which might be going back to that time as a kid where we learned to stand up for ourselves, or that old memory, that old pattern that wasn't working before. But if we experience something hard like that, we can be tempted to go back. And that's one of the things in Jesus that we learned, is that that is not the end. That with Jesus, like there is no going back. Like if you were reborn, Brian Noel, the phrase he uses, he says, "My old man is dead, and I'm a new person now." Mm. Like I can't go back to that person. There is no going back for that person because Jesus made me a new one. And so, as much as they tried to go back, as soon as they saw that he was risen,
can't go back.
You can't go back.
Yeah. So one of the other frustrating things, in contrast to you can't go back, when people are triggered, their adult coping skills are missing in action. They are just gone. They can't find them. They can't see them, which then really adds to the horrific feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm in danger. Something bad is going to happen, and I have no skills at all to do anything about it. And then when your brain does its job, which I think, Kasey, is just really cool the way God designed us, when your brain goes, okay, something is wrong. Oh, it's tied in with an old memory. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm in danger. And it rallies the troops. It prepares you. It throws adrenaline and all kinds of chemicals into your bloodstream so that if a danger occurs, you're ready to go. Well, that freaks you out even more because you think, oh my gosh, now I'm really cranked up. And so that's why the very best thing, you can do is do nothing. But what happens is you've got all this energy and you've got all this vulnerability and you've got all this scary. And so it's easy to want to go do something about it.
Yeah. And that's
don't.
Don't. That's the key here. And one of the things that made me go back to is the way you're describing it is Peter is just Peter's denials. When Peter he just had one of his best friends who'd been with him the whole time betray them, and he's watching his Savior, who he's seen bring people back from the dead, just stand there and let these Pharisees railroad him into this bad direction. And in that time, even though he's been a disciple he's walked with Jesus for years, he has to have picked up so much enlightenment and understanding of God and justice and how and the power that he's been walking alongside. But when this traumatic thing is happening and someone comes up and says, "Aren't you with him?" He's just that little fisherman again. And he says, "No, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not with him." And then later Jesus has a chance to redeem that, and maybe goes through a little bit of therapy with him when he that comes back and the 3 times says, "Peter, do you love me? Okay, well then tend to my flock. Peter, do you love me? Then feed my sheep." That's probably the wrong order, but so he gives him that chance, and I like to assume that Peter looked at that and recognized that. And so the next time, when we get into the book of Acts, Peter doesn't act like a fisherman anymore. Peter is grown up. He's been able to use those grown up, walked with Jesus skills that we all have. As we grow in our faith and get into the Word and stuff like that, we are all armored with that stuff. He was a different person, but he had that slip up. Even walking with Jesus, you can have that moment of regression, but just like him, you can reteach yourself how to go through that process. And that's in this next one. In this next episode, we'll go over some of these different ways that Leon and Dr. Barry have for people to do that. So we encourage everybody listening, as always, get in your Bibles, look at things like that. But if you want to spend some time thinking about even the small T traumas, the way you react if someone cuts in front of you in the line in the grocery store, the way you react to some of these others, maybe these small things that maybe can damage our relationships because of the way you react. What are some ways that you maybe wish you could find a new way to react to things that you'd like to look at? And then come back and join us next week, and we'll talk all about how you can even just yourself with some practice kind of work on reworking these buttons and what they actually trigger.